Okay, great. Okay, so welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us today at our virtual open day event of our Academic Center of Excellence in Cybersecurity Research. So this is an informal event that we're organizing to mainly to introduce our three new members of the center. So three great researchers that joined from two from Imperial, one from Northumbria, although I'm pretty sure I'm not pronouncing the name of that university right. I apologize in advance for that. And also to give a sort of a showcase of the of some of the research that some of our students have been doing. As you know, UCL has the a very large number of PhD students working on in cybersecurity and in the broad cybersecurity space. But it's also, we also have a CDP in cybersecurity, so there's a lot of activities. So unfortunately, it wouldn't be time to organize something covering all the students. Definitely not in in a couple of hours, but hopefully there's going to be other events for that. So that's really the plan for today, is to have three short talks, short-ish talks by Anna Maria, Arthur, and Mark, and then we'll have a short break, and we have the some short talks by a few of our students, with the session that was organized by our students. So thank you, Sharad, for being volunteered to organizing that and running this session. We really appreciate it. So before we get started, just a few words about the Academic Center of Excellence. I see a lot of names that I recognize, so I'm pretty sure that you know what the Academic Center of Excellence is. I see some names that I don't recognize, so welcome and nice to virtually meet you. So the Academic Center of Excellence is a center that has been recognized by the UK government with NCSC. Like before it was GCHQ, now it's NCSC, and EPSRC, UKRI. I know, sorry, many acronyms, but basically, the UK government and the entities that deal with cybersecurity in the UK, in the public sector, so GCHQ and CSC, and sort of the National Science Foundation sort of funding body, which is the UKRI EPSRC in the UK. And so there is a number of universities, I forgot how many now, but more than 10 for sure in the UK that are recognized as Academic Center of Excellence in Cybersecurity Research. So it's an official stamp of approval, let's say, that the kind of work that that's been done in that university is excellent and in cybersecurity. And one thing that I really want to highlight is that there is really a number of different expertise that go in these centers. For sure, definitely that's the case for UCL. So it's not only sort of the people working on what would you consider core information security areas. And in fact, it's not only people from the computer science department. So we have members from many different departments, from electrical and electronics engineering, and Anna is actually in that department, crime science, policy, public policy. We had geography, in the past even psychology. So there is a very broad interdisciplinary approach to cybersecurity, and so it's a very nice way to have different skills and different disciplines represented in the university. And the fact that there is this recognition also means that there is a network of people and centers in different universities. We typically have a few events across all centers. We have a annual conference. Typically, we have an annual conference involving all the centers. So that's really great that we have this community and sort of we support each other. So like I said, I mean, the center is just a way to get people together and to promote and interface our activities with the external world, both in the public sector. I already mentioned strong connection to the UK government, but also in the private sector. So we have a number of industrial partners that we work across many different activities, from research funding, research grants, research projects, to co-supervision of students, both for projects like master projects or in PhD research. We have an MSc in information security that is obviously very much related to what we do. We have a CDT in cybersecurity, and overall, we are part of several institutes like Refrain, which is the National Institute for essentially privacy and online harms research. We have a strong presence in sort of the cryptocurrencies and decentralized finance. We actually, Arthur is going to talk about DeFi today. We have a strong history with human-centered research in cybersecurity, human factors in cybersecurity, and Mark is going to actually cover that part. We have a lot of history with work in privacy, and Anna Maria is going to talk about, among other things, privacy in IoT. And overall, please just Google us, and you can find all the details about all the kinds of different activities that we do. And hopefully there's going to be some time for questions and for interactions. But other than that, really, I just wanted to welcome you. I'm going to shut up now and see if there is any quick questions from the audience before we start with the presentations. I guess not. So that's pretty great. So we can start with the presentations. Sorry, I don't have the agenda in front of me. Who is first? Sorry about that.
It's me.
It's Anna, right? Okay, great.
Let me share.
Okay, great. So yeah, and I think you can. Okay, great. You can share your screen. Perfect. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Great. So. Okay, so thank you so much, Anna, for giving for giving this presentation today. We're really excited to have you on board at UCL. It's really a pleasure to welcome you in our center. Just a sort of a brief introduction for Anna. So Anna has joined UCL, I think, in September. Right, so very, very recently. She was at Imperial College before. I think she still maintains an affiliation there. She was a research fellow there. She's done a lot of work on many different aspects of Internet of Things, and a lot of very, very interesting data-driven research on studying, understanding, and analyzing and mitigating the different challenges of IoT. Her work has been covered in many times by the press. There's been a lot of great work that has been published at top tier conferences like IMC and beyond. And without further ado, Anna, please take it away. Thank you so much for your time and please, thanks.
Thank you. Thanks, Emiliano, for asking me. Thanks for the amazing introduction. Thanks, everybody, for being here. Yeah, today I'm going to present a research that is going on since 4 years now. And the majority of this work has been done in collaboration with amazing people, Mandalari from Imperial, Daniel Dwyer-Joyce from Northeastern University, other people for Max Planck Institute for Informatics in Germany. So as soon as I arrived in London 4 years ago, surely you don't know that because from my accent you can understand I'm clearly British, but we started buying hundreds of consumer Internet of Things devices for measuring them and trying to understand the privacy implications and security implications for consumers and also possible mitigations. We know that any object nowadays can be connected to the internet, from smart speakers to cameras, even your air fryer can be connected to the internet. And we call this Internet of Things. And they're great. They make our life comfortable. They play music for us. And today, these systems are even more in demand due to the low touch experience of them. But the question is that I had was why they are so cheap and what is the real value they give back to us? And this is where my research journey started. I wanted to know what we are invisible trading in exchange to these devices. When we talk about privacy and data for Internet of Things systems, we need to talk about three things: privacy against gimmicks and minor conveniences, how IoT devices expose privacy in a smart home, and most importantly, what this means for the future. So what if we are exchanging privacy for gimmicks and minor conveniences? The reason of the research is that the main problem is that these devices are like a black hole. They are black boxes. They can, by definition, access the internet, and therefore they may expose private information. But there is a lack of understanding of what information is sent and to who, and there is a lack of understanding of regional differences in regulations. For example, we have regulations here in Europe, GDPR, but this is not available overseas. So at the beginning of the journey, we wanted to know a little bit more about what these devices are doing with your data, and we have a look in depth of how those devices violate our privacy. So our research at first, research goal was about like what is the destination of the IoT network traffic, which kind of information is sent, and if the devices are exposing information unexpectedly. And for doing this, we basically needed to hone the devices. So what we did, we built two IoT taskbeds, one in US and the other one in UK, and we bought more than 200 devices in 2 different countries. So as you can see, the one in the left is the one in Northeastern University, where there is a studio apartment in the office where students can go and use the devices as they like. And we have a similar one, a little bit more ugly, in the UK, but we are working on that, and we are basically doing it better in the basement of the Dyson building in Imperial. So our main contribution at first was a taskbed for running repeatable automated IoT experiments at scale. How we did experiments? So we used the taskbed and the devices. So we have control experiments in which we automate all the interaction with the devices using a companion app, because the majority of these devices you can use using your phone. And we use speaker for automatically asking questions to the smart speakers, for example. And then we capture all the traffic these devices are exchanging over the internet, and we not only capture the traffic when we are doing experiments, but also the idle traffic, so the background traffic when you are not using the device. The data collection happens on the router, so the router our software is able to distinguish the traffic between device and experiments, so the behavior of the devices is completely isolated. And the first research questions that we had was, what is the destinations of the IoT network traffic? And we saw that the majority of the traffic that is going from basically the devices that are in UK is not going in Europe, but is going somewhere else. That is US in this case, of China, for example. This is important because most of the traffic of the UK devices is behind Europe. So the traffic from many categories of IoT devices is sent outside the taskbed's privacy jurisdiction. And this can be basically a violation of the GDPR. The other research question that we had, it was like, does a device expose information completely unexpectedly? And we discovered that some weird behavior, like for example, video doorbell, activating even if at each motion, even if we opt out for that in the IoT app. Popular smart televisions contacting Netflix, Google, Facebook, even if we opt out for tracker and advertisements in our privacy policies, and smart speakers misactivating without saying, so they were activating even if we didn't pronounce the wake word, like instead of Alexa, like I like Star Trek. And this work has been published at IMC, and our software for creating the lab and sniffing the traffic and experiment is available in this link. We also won the Community Contribution Award for that. And then we wanted to understand a little bit more about misactivation of smart speakers, because there was a lot of noise at the time in the press about is Alexa basically spying on us. We create a methodology basically for understanding if a smart speaker is misactivating. So when a smart speaker activates, basically what happens is that your voice is recorded locally, the wake word is recognized, and then the recording of what you ask is sent to the cloud process all the question basically, and then give back to the user the answer. So the cloud may store your voice, basically, your recording, and everything that is happening in your home. So the goal of this work was basically try to understand how frequent the smart speaker misactivates, if a misactivation is signal, if they adapt over time, so if they improve their algorithm for understanding your voice, for how long they misactivated, if they are biased, like if they misactivate more with a voice that is from a country instead of others, which words are the one that triggered the misactivation. And for doing this, we developed a methodology in which we put basically all the smart speakers that we can find in the market in a box and expose them to some content. In this case, it was some Netflix shows. And then we try to understand if we can capture the activation by using three methodologies: camera recording, cloud data, and network traffic. So this is basically our testing cabinet. It's connected to a server. We provide Wi-Fi to the smart speakers, and then we also provide the content. And then we try in a completely automatic way through the transcript of the show that we use for triggering the misactivation to see how many times this happened. And basically what we saw is that most smart speakers, particularly Invoke, that was the one that at the time was sent by Microsoft, Echo second generation, but also HomePod, they constantly misactivate up to 20 times per day in average. And the misactivations can last for up to 10 seconds in the case of HomePod. So this is a real privacy risk, because this is like is enough for grabbing a conversation in a private conversation in your smart home, basically. Most misactivations are wake word variation. So the good news is that there is no evidence of secret wake words. So the smart speakers doesn't activate when you're saying, I wanna buy, but misactivate because the algorithm basically they're using is not very good. So it means that, for example, when you say instead of, okay, Google, you say, hey, hi, oh, hey, you told, so something that can be misunderstood by the smart speakers as okay, Google. So this is a good sign, but there are also some patterns to be used by an attacker to forge the commands of misactivating the smart speakers and grabbing your conversation, basically. This paper was published in 2020 in PATS. And again, all the code and more information are available in this link. We then continue our journey behind the user's home. And another first step to address this privacy risk is to act as the internet service provider and try to identify and locate IoT devices in the network. So while some limited solutions exist for identifying IoT devices in sample network traffic data, a key question is whether device discovery can be done by inter-service providers. In particular, it is challenging for an ISP to efficiently track and trace activity from IoT devices deployed by its millions of subscribers. Also, deploying an agent inside the premise of the inter-service provider customers is not scalable. Active measurements that don't work with the device behind NATs, and deep packet inspections raises privacy concerns. So in this work, what we did, we developed and evaluate a scalable methodology to detect and monitor IoT devices as subscriber lines with limited sample data in the wild. How we did that? In particular, we discovered that devices have repeated patterns of communications that appear even in sparsely sampled data. We basically create some detection rules that can be generated using limited packet fields, and we detect the devices from 77% of our studied IoT manufacturer in a huge inter-service provider and IXV within minutes. Our methodology consists of 5 steps. We generate the ground truth data from our labs. We check the visibility of the data in the inter-service provider. We generate the detection rules using combination of domains, ports number, and then we cross-check the detection rules, and finally we detect the devices in the wild. To generate the ground truth traffic, we consider 56 IoT devices from our labs. And we produce idle and active traffic in using the same methodology we used for the first paper from the 2 IoT testbed. We have data from a large residential inter-service provider that offers inter-services to 50 million broadband subscriber lines. And the inter-service provider uses NetFlow to monitor traffic flows at all routers in its network. We then generate the detection routes by monitoring the IoT devices. So the outcome is an IoT dictionary that contains mapping for individual IoT services to sets of domains, IP addresses, and ports. Using these detection rules, we then track them in the data that we have. We noticed that the amount of frequency of network traffic that an IoT device is exchanged with its backend infrastructures varies from device to devices. It really depends on the complexities of its services. Most devices are supported by their own sets of domains, as we can see from SmartBot, for example. And for many of them, this is just a small set containing less than 10 domains. But for others, like for example, the one using the content delivery network, like for example, Apple devices, this means that we cannot really detect all the devices in the wild, but we can detect the majority of them. In fact, considering only 1 hour interval, we detect more than 1 million subscriber line Alexa-enabled devices, and we noted also some diurnal pattern tools. Increasing the observation periods helped us detecting more devices. So we detect IoT devices for 20% of the subscriber lines. We then report the detection using a heat map where each column corresponds to a day and each row an IoT devices with its detection level. Popular devices in the country of the inter-service provider are more prominent than unpopular ones or the ones that are not available in the country markets. Super interesting, based on the ground truth traffic observation, we use a threshold of number of packets per hour to filter our subscription lines that actively use Alexa-enabled devices in a given hour. So we could even we could even understand if a user is at a certain time activating Alexa. So based on these thresholds, we said the number of actively used devices reaches 27,000 during the day and weekends following the diurnal trend of the human activity. This work has been published in IMC. Again, more details about the work, signatures for identify the devices, and data are available in this link. So what we found is that most of the traffic is not going to the manufacturer, but is going somewhere else. That may be third party for the majority of the time, or support parties like trackers and advertisers. So these devices are contacting destinations that are third party. Often, the contract you set up with your provider allows them to do that because you basically tick upset, but the standard user doesn't check. So because terms and conditions are really too vague, too long. So this enables a privacy risk, especially as you don't know who those third parties may be. So often people tell me, okay, they have my data in California, who cares what they can do with it? The main problem is profiling. So based on the devices that they traffic from the device, third parties can create a unique profile for the user, preferences, user interests. It's easy to see what you like and how you can be influenced. So we will have a mass influencing. Think about the Facebook Analytica scandal, for example. And the voice signal is also rich resource that discloses several possible states of a speaker, such as emotional states, stress level, physical condition, age, gender, personal threats. So when we talk about the future of these devices, we know that Alexa house is today won't be there. Obviously, it will become something much more sophisticated. So what happens when these devices become more like cognitive prosthetics, playing future influence on your life, helping you on your daily decisions? And this platform will learn your preference, anticipate your problem solving, support your mind and long-term goal. It may sound great, but actually in this future, we may see individuals using your data from the wrong reasons. Because if you know most things about someone, it's easy to adjust and impact their behavior from voting to shopping. So I think that in reality, there is a more positive feature at play. One where we can achieve transparency and privacy by default. We need to do that for the users, so they know what is going on and what devices, which devices are trustworthy, what the devices are doing with your data. So now we will explain some future applications and mitigations that we put in place for this problem, because we cannot really continue concealing and reducing responsibility for this organization. So in my vision, we will see the control back to the hand of the consumer. We will use similar devices as Alexa, but for protecting our privacy. And we will have benefit, but we will have an awareness of when our information is being used negatively or for other purposes. So, for example, privacy and security label, privacy and security certificates. We will have manufacturer user description profile for the manufacturer to basically declare what they're doing with destinations and the port they are contacting. So the control will finally be back to the users. So what we develop and what we are working on now is IoTrim. IoTrim is basically a software that goes in the home router and try to understand using artificial intelligence, which are the destinations that are essential or non-essential for the devices to be used. We started investigating this, and we were able already to block 61% of the destinations that these devices are contacting. And IoTrim also has a user interface where user can decide and control their privacy. So final control will be back to the users. This paper was published in PATS in 2021, but there is a lot of work we are still doing with IoTrim. But if you want to know more about the paper, just go there, download it, and you will see all the methodology. So the basic idea of IoTrim is that from our previous work, we learned that some traffic is essential and some it's non-essential. So the idea is that maybe we can block some non-essential communication and still be able to use the device. What happened? In our previous work, we saw that destinations can be classified in pairs, support, and third parties. So we manually tried to selectively block some of the destination above, and as a result, we saw that some devices actually aren't working. So we tried to automate this process of blocking and verifying if actually this destination can be blocked. So the goals of this research was how we can automatically separate essential and non-essential traffic, how prevalent is the non-essential traffic, and if there are common patterns in non-essential traffic. And obviously how we can mitigate and provide a tool for the users to block the traffic. As any other research idea we had until now, there are various challenges that need to be addressed. And the main challenge is automation. So IoT devices are really hard to test automatically because they offer very different kind of functions. So they suffer also in frequent service outages that must be detected. And they typically require manual user interaction. So it's very hard to verify if a function was actually executed or not. But we had some idea. First of all, you can automate the usage of the app for controlling the device. And then you can use also network traffic patterns to classify IoT devices responses. So this is what we are doing. Obviously, our non-goal is that we consider IoT devices as black boxes, so you cannot really work on the firmware of the IoT devices. And we don't consider every functionality. For example, in a smart bulb, we only consider the principal functions, like, for example, switching on and off the lights, control the brightness. So we develop a measurements methodology, and we consider in this study 31 devices. We have a router with IP filtering and DNS filtering capabilities. We basically do DNS override. We have power plugs and scripts to power cycle of the devices. We have trigger scripts to invoke IoT devices functionality. And then we have companion app, interaction, automatically voice assistant interaction. We also automated the way to detect if a voice assistant was activated. And then we have probe scripts for probing if actually the function was executed or not. For each device and function, we identify a trigger and a probe. So the trigger is created for executed the function that can be switching on the light, for example, and the probe for determining if the function was executed. For example, for the smart bulb, the trigger is switching on the light through the companion app, and the probe is compared the screenshot of the app while I'm executing the trigger with the ground truth screenshot of switching on the light. And we tested the probe 30 times against the ground truth, and we got an accuracy of at least 80%. How we identify all the destinations? So basically, at first, we needed to collect all the destinations, and sometimes these destinations are not unique, but sometimes they change over time. So when we see the behavior of destinations like the level domains changing over time, we just group them using these techniques, basically. We then needed to identify the non-essential traffic. So we collect all the destinations and block them one by one. If the function succeeds when a destination is blocked, then we classify the destination as not required. Otherwise, is required, so essential. So we tested location and devices. We tested all the devices in the UK. We have like different devices that we test: camera, home automation, smart hub, even televisions. We found that more than 50% of the devices have non-essential traffic, mostly cameras, smart speakers, and videos. So devices that are in a way streaming content, because probably they are using targeted advertisements too, because non-required destinations are contacting both my camera, speakers, but it also happens that simple devices, like for example, TP-Link smart bulb, has some non-essential destinations, like for example, is contacting 3 destinations for reaching on the light, and then only one is actually essential for doing that function. Third parties are always not required, probably because of the background app activity, like for example, Netflix in the case of the televisions. But unfortunately, we cannot really know why first party are not required, because the majority of the network traffic is encrypted. The best guess is that those destinations are used for firmware upgrade or maintenance. The worst case is that they're used for data collection. There is a good news on all of this. Non-essential traffic is relatively small, so less than 1 kilobytes per device. However, this is still enough for like triggering or signaling the presence of the device, its status, basic data from sensors, like for example, is the door open, close, there is a motion, there is an alarm, or there is no alarm. As you know, there are already some alt blocking lists available out there, but existing approaches like Pi-hole, for example, that others block destinations, they don't grab the destinations that are non-essential for the devices, because they are really general and usually used for web trackers that contact very different destinations than IoT devices. Thus, they miss all the non-required, mostly of the non-required destinations that we specifically use for blocking for consumer IoT devices. So we compare our non-required destination with Pi-hole, Pi-bug, motherboard, stop-ad list, and only 6 out of 62 non-required destinations are in existing block lists. So they are, in this case, of limited help in blocking IoT non-essential traffic. We checked for other insights for helping building our list of non-required destinations, and we discovered that most traffic of non-required destination is encrypted, and with rare exceptions and destinations. For some destinations, over 6 months, they don't change over time, so they have a fixed backend infrastructure, these devices. And this motivates the use of our non-required destination at the baseline for IoT blocking lists. To mitigate the non-essential IoT traffic, we propose IoTrim. This is an IoT blocking system composed of device acting as a router. This can be any computer device, with at least 2 network interfaces, and then the destinations list, the list of non-required and required destinations, and the destination list. So we create a system for using destinations list as a crowdsourcing. So the destination list will be maintained via options, via organizations that are willing to adopt our methodology for classify non-essential and essential destinations. So this is a prototype implementation of the interface of IoStream, implemented on a home router. We also implement an app, and IoStream automatically identify all the devices connected to the router. So it's also use machine learning from the second paper that we presented. And it's also possible to enable and disable IoStream for a specific device, for example. Obviously, there are some limitations. So for example, the destinations can change more frequently, the lists that are updated. We didn't study all the possible functions. It's difficult to scale to every expected input up to for every function of the devices. But these limitations are not critical and also shared with other blocking systems. So blocking system may miss or break something sometimes, but they're useful regarding. We also get some traction for IoStream. So basically we create a spin-out from Imperial, and we talk with many inter-service provider, be it in UK, Telefonica in Spain, Telecom Italia in Italy. We won some awards. They gave us 25K from Deutsche Telekom, gave us some money from developing a proof of concept. So we are now in Innova UK grants for cybersecurity startup academic accelerator that I suggest you to have a look at because it's a very good program. And we also talk with the stakeholders, like for example, data authorities, like for example, the Garante della Privacy, the Italian Data Authority. Basically, we got positive feedback on IoStream. We are continuing the research on that, and we hope that we can commercialize it, basically. So what's next? What I'm doing at UCL, and what I hope we can do together, basically. So my current research agenda has the following main thrust. First of all, when we talk about the future of the Internet of Things ecosystem, we really needed to use the word strengthening. So we really needed to basically help the users to be aware of what will happen in the future. And for doing this, we need to implement three things: trust, interconnectivity, and awareness. Trust about try basically to understand the endpoints practice, so the IoT devices, but not only, also the practice of the inter-service provider, for example. So we need to have domain-specific guidelines and framework for enhancing trust. We need to talk about interconnectivity because these devices are interconnected between each other. So until now, we just saw the traffic that is going from the IoT devices to their network infrastructure, but sometimes the devices also communicate internally between each other. So this is like a problem to solve because most of this protocol is not really readable, like for example, Bluetooth or Zigbee or the protocols that they're using internally. And we also need to provide tools for the users, for aware the user. So usable monitors for IoT, context-aware privacy, personalized privacy, because also maybe some users they don't want to block the destinations. They actually like to have back the advertisements and suggestions about what to do. So how we can do that? We are doing so here at UCL. I'm building another testbed. It is an industrial IoT testbed. I started by some industrial IoT devices, but also medical IoT devices that is very critical nowadays because these devices are already in use, like for example, pacemakers, smart pacemakers, sensors that you put in brain of the patient. But these devices are really easily hackable. There were a lot of attention in the press about that. So I'm actually buying these devices and building an industrial medical IoT testbed here in UCL. And then we are also working together with the UK Dementia Research Institute for doing a real trial about these systems, IoStream, to be applied to patient's home and basically measure and try to understand if anomalies are happening in the patient's home. And then for mitigations, we did the startup, but we also have real deployments and evaluations. And we're working with the data authority, UH authority, for developing this EU authority for developing these privacy labels, so these privacy and security certificates for IoT devices. So in Europe, there is this Cybersecurity Act that will be on hopefully in 2 years, but I don't think so, for basically certify IoT devices. So having, let's say, privacy and security by default. But this is really something that I don't see happening soon. But for this, we really need to act, and quickly, before even regulation is on. So I think I finished my time. I had other things to present, but I think we can talk about this offline when we will meet. So thank you very much, everyone, for listening, and I'm open to any question now or later, whenever we have time.
Thanks so much, Anna. Thanks for the great presentation. Yeah, we're running a few minutes behind. That's my fault. But yeah, I mean, we definitely have time for questions. So if anybody wants to just unmute themselves and ask questions, or use the chat, or raise your virtual hand, we can just do it informally. I see a raised hands by Lorenzo. Go on, Lorenzo.
Yeah. Hi, morning, everyone. Thanks, Anna. This was a really great, interesting talk, and you touched on a few things that I was thinking of as you were going ahead. So I was wondering whether you guys, because you said that you didn't observe any changes in the endpoints communication over 6 months. I'm talking about the last part of your talk, but you mentioned that this is non-conclusive in the sense that there's a lot of behavior that you weren't able to, you cannot really exercise completely. So there's internal communication, there are firmware upgrades, and so forth and so on. So what is your take there? What do you believe will be an interesting research direction? Or let me just try to see whether this is where you're trying to go towards. Do you believe that actually working on detecting drift, so that as a shift or any form of concept drift in general, would be a valuable way to improve the approach in a real life deployment, or not so much?
Yeah, so the only way to solve this problem of like having something that was blocked that actually doesn't need to be blocked is using crowdsourcing. So what we did, so you have this, let's say, this baseline block list, and then you also tell the users that if they want, or if something is not working in the home, they can unblock the destinations, and this information is collected by IoTrim. So when you see that, for example, a destination that was blocked actually doesn't need to be blocked, and the user unblock it, many users in the world are actually unblocking it, that means that the destination is actually not blockable. And then you collect this crowdsourcing information for improving your blocking list. Another thing that you can do is using machine learning for understanding the traffic that is blockable and not blockable. This is actually our next paper. So we are trying to see if it's possible to check and see some usage patterns of blockable patterns in the network traffic, and then use machine learning for detecting this traffic. But it's very hard, and it really depends on the devices. So from some devices, it's possible, like the devices that are really doing something small, like, for example, switching on the light, that's it, or switching on and off the kettle, but not for devices that are streaming videos, like, for example, televisions, where you can install thousands of hubs. So there, the traffic patterns are really variable. So it's possible, and the only way to for solving this is using crowdsourcing.
Cool, thanks.
Thank you.
Any more questions? If not, I'll ask a quick question. So, what does your research mean for like end users who, like me, have Alexa, the Echo Dot thing at home? What is your message to them? Burn it?
Yeah, so
or?
Yeah. So basically, the message is like, be aware that these devices can violate your privacy. So sometimes I suggest the users to mute the Alexa. I know that this is like you're losing the functions that actually for what you bought the Alexa, but it's better to mute it. Or like, for example, when you're not using the television, disconnect from the internet. This is the only tool that the users can use nowadays for protecting themselves. In the future, hopefully there will be an IO trim in every home, so they can see actually and visualizing what the devices are doing in real time. But until then, yeah, just stay protect, just opt out in the app for all the trackers and advertisements that they come out. But sometimes it's really funny, because sometimes if you don't upset the terms and conditions, you cannot use the device. So it's really funny.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Thanks. Any more questions? Well, I guess not. So thank you, Anna. Thanks a lot for your great presentation. And again, welcome to UCL and welcome to the ACE Center, virtual clapping. So I think Mark is next. Mark, are you? Oh, yeah, great. Okay. Well, Mark is proactively already sharing. We can't hear you though. We see your screen, all your apps that you have used, that you have opened. Mark? We see you're moving your mouse, but we don't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, yes, great.
Okay, just trying to
okay.
Coordinate two different screens. Perfect. Just get that out of the way. Okay, can you see me okay as well?
I just see a black screen. Okay, now here you are. Hi,
okay,
Mark.
Perfect. Thank you. Yeah. Okay. So my name is.
Can I just introduce you real quick for those of
sure.
you who don't know you? So yeah. So thanks, Mark, for your time today. So Mark joined UCL also very recently, I think September, if I'm not mistaken. And joined my group, the information security group at UCL-CS, and he's been doing a lot of work on interdisciplinary research, sort of the intersection of HCI, security and safety, and he is also a part of the Refrain Center that I mentioned before, as he has a Refrain funded project on proactive online harms intervention tools. And it has a lot of history of doing high impact work with law enforcement, with marginalized communities, and so on. So thank you, Mark. Take it away without further ado.
Thank you, Emiliano. Yeah, so yeah, my name is Mark Warner. I'm a lecturer in information security at UCL. So what I wanted to do today was introduce myself. So it was an introductory talk to introduce who I am, to give you a little bit of an idea about my background. And I wanted to talk about a number of research projects that I've been involved in, and many of which are ongoing. Most of these projects focus around some aspect of online safety or online harms. And what I'm broadly interested in is looking to understand how we can take more sort of proactive approaches to reducing online harms, and more proactive approaches to understanding some of these really complex social technical problems. So yeah, so a little bit about me. So I started off my career completely outside of academia. So I started off my career in digital policing, working across private sector, government and law enforcement agencies, both inside the UK and outside of the UK. So I spent some time working out in the Middle East as a technical advisor for a police service in the United Arab Emirates, and I was heavily involved in wide called case-driven research. So research that is driven by specific cases that we're dealing with at any given time. And in that sort of past life, my main area of focus was mobile phone and embedded system forensics. So developing and refining techniques for acquiring data from these types of devices, primarily mobile devices, GPSs, and other embedded systems, and also then developing techniques for processing the data that was acquired from these devices. So in particular, I spent a lot of time reverse engineering flash memory, where leveling implementations, developing bespoke software for parsing data acquired from devices through primarily through direct memory reads, not exclusively, but primarily. And was also involved in a really fascinating Home Office funded project while I was working for the Metropolitan Police Service in London, looking at how law enforcement agencies might be able to cope with increasing levels of security on mobile devices and the issues that this raises for digital forensic investigations who have legitimate lawful reasons for gaining access to these devices. So I sort of overlapping with that. I did a master's in security management, which I finished in 2016, and that really gave me the sort of the academic research bug. And then decided to go and pursue a PhD. I was lucky enough to get onto a PhD program here at UCL over in UCL's Interaction Centre. So I did my PhD in human-computer interaction between 2016 and 2020, and then moved up to Newcastle to take up a lecture position later, assistant professor position at Northumbria University. And as Emiliano said, I joined UCL in September. So yeah, quite new to the university. So I've been really fortunate and lucky to have been involved in a number of really interesting worthwhile projects. So my PhD was funded through an EU innovative training network, looking at various aspects. So the project broadly was looking at various aspects related to privacy and usability. And my research in particular, as part of my PhD, was interested in the effects of non-disclosure and how non-disclosures are perceived and how online social platforms can design for non-disclosures, and particularly around sensitive health information. So I use the case study of HIV status information being disclosed or not being disclosed within dating applications used predominantly by men who have sex with men, and identified a number of concerns around how these non-disclosure options were being implemented into these social platforms that really limited their effectiveness. So whilst these disclosure mechanisms provided the option for non-disclose, for the option to not disclose those options for certain groups who are using those applications, this was very, very ineffective. So whilst at Northumbria, I was involved in an AHRC-funded project known as OMDAC. So this is the Observatory for Monitoring Data-Driven Approaches to COVID-19. And OMDAC looked at the role, so this was one of these COVID-19 response projects, and it looked at the role of data, in particular data-driven systems, in the UK's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. So it didn't just look at the response from a public health perspective, but also looked at how other areas of society were using and sometimes adapting existing data-driven systems to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic, again from within the health domain, but also looking at how policing and security, as well as local government, were using data-driven systems to respond to the pandemic. I'm also currently, as Emiliano says, I'm also currently involved in a project called Key to Kindness, which has been funded through Refrain. It's a very interdisciplinary project looking at proactive moderation prompts to prevent the sending of inappropriate content or toxic content. This is the project that I'm going to look at. I'm going to be talking a bit more about today. It is an ongoing project. We haven't done our final evaluation yet, but I'm going to talk about what we have done so far. I'm going to talk about what we are planning to do for our final evaluation, and then I hope to come back at some point and present some of the findings from this work. And then lastly, I'm involved in a really fascinating project looking at how families are being impacted by misinformation. How they challenge misinformation spread within family networks and some of the barriers that they face to challenging this type of content. And then before I move on to the next slide, just to say that I'm always interested in exploring collaboration. So if anything that I've mentioned here or throughout the talk is of interest to you and you want to discuss it further and potentially explore collaborations, then please do reach out. So why should we look to implement more proactive approaches to dealing with online harms? Well, we see shifts in how many problems within society are being tackled. In healthcare, which is probably the most obvious one, there is this mantra for prevention as opposed to cure, with the idea that it's better for public health and could be less costly in the long run, so as the return on investment. With preventions being less expensive than treatments and having some broader benefits to society and to the economy. And we see similar shifts in thinking within policing and security, with public health approaches to policing being taken across different areas of policing, including violent crime. For example, we see the use of data to predict where and when violent crimes may occur, as well as models to better predict those who may be more likely to offend and be victimised. I'm doing some work at the moment with Thames Valley Police, who are looking to develop a number of different proactive interventions for tackling, in particular, tackling knife crime. So many health and security problems, as we know, are underpinned by some really complex social needs, and online harms are no different. But these the technologies that have been developed are often exacerbating many of these harmful behaviours that we're seeing today, due to the way in which these technologies have been designed. We need to therefore be very careful about how we then intervene. So if we're intervening with some technological solution, we need to be careful that we're not then inadvertently exacerbating these problems even further. And I will touch on this a little bit in this talk. So as I said, I'm going to talk a little bit about this Key to Kindness project. I say it's an ongoing project that looks to help to address the issue of stop toxic speech production through proactive moderation prompts built into mobile device keyboards. So in the first stage of this research, we're interested in hearing and collecting views from various different stakeholder groups about their thoughts and views about related to this type of intervention approach. And what we also did is we also used these stakeholder groups to help inform the design of our intervention, of our mobile keyboard that would embed these moderation prompts. So we engaged with a number of different groups. We engaged with experts in the field, including individuals from hate charities. We also engaged with online content moderators, who are a really fascinating bunch to engage with. They sort of wear two hats. They're dealing with this type of content on a very regular basis as they're in their roles as content moderators, but they're also receiving harmful content as part of their roles as well. So we got to understand more from them from two perspectives, really. And then we also engaged with potential target audience, so people that we thought this type of intervention could be effective for. So we asked participants at this stage of the project. We asked participants firstly to discuss where the boundaries are between the different types of content. So, for example, hate and harmful messages. We were also interested in understanding what these stakeholder groups thought about the benefits of this type of solution, but also the potential negatives to this approach and these types of interventions. And then finally, we sent them off into groups, and we asked them to then start imagining what this type of keyboard might look like, right? What would they design if they were to be responsible for designing this keyboard? And we were sort of very keen to give them as much sort of freedom and flexibility to go off and design as creatively as they want. And some of the designs that we got back were, quite absurd. I think the best one was a suggestion that we should have a picture of an old lady or an old man sort of wagging their finger when toxic content was detected. But the purpose here wasn't really to sort of take these verbatim and then apply them within our final intervention, but it was really to try to unpack some of these designs. And so even that silly design idea, there was something embedded within that. There was something underneath that was quite interesting to explore. So as part from that stakeholder engagement study, we identified two sets of themes. So there was one theme related to considerations of use, and there was another theme related specifically to design. So these two sets of themes are linked. So the design of the system could impact on potential harm caused by the system itself. For example, we identified the potential for such a system to be used to further abuse, so negative or abusability of applications which embed toxicity models. But then we also explored design factors that may potentially be able to limit some of those potential abuses of the system. So in terms of considerations of use, stakeholders were very mindful about the context and had a very sort of clear idea about the contextual factors that may impact on the effectiveness of this type of intervention. There was also a strong feeling that this type of intervention wouldn't be effective for all types of audiences. So there are some that potentially this would be very effective for, others very ineffective for, and potentially could exacerbate harm, which led to this theme around the abusability of these types of interventions. And then the theme related to design, we started to unpack three main aspects related to design. One was related to the timing of the intervention. So at what point in the interaction would any moderation prompt be most effective and be less intrusive? How might the output of the model be displayed to the user? So the abstraction level, for example, of the model. So do we present a specific percentage score of how toxic or hateful this content is? Or do we just provide a very binary, this is hateful, this is not hateful? And then the use of friction to enhance effectiveness. So there was a sort of this sort of tension that rose, whereby there was a sort of clear understanding that there would need to be some friction built into the system in order for it to be effective. But if this went too far or was done in the wrong way, then it may create a system that effectively then becomes unusable. And this is somewhat linked in with the timing of the intervention. So the timing of the intervention can have an impact on the level of friction. So we're going to sort of talk through some of these themes, in particular the context of use themes. We'll start off with this theme of context. So we identified numerous contextual factors that may challenge social technical systems that integrate toxicity models, such as a moderation prompt. So these can be thought of as factors that might be important to consider when deciding whether content is hateful or hurtful. And as far as we know, these are factors that don't commonly get featured in toxicity detection models. So looking at one example, we identified in and out group conversations, or in versus out group conversations, which can describe whether a conversation is happening within an existing group or community or not. So content that might be considered toxic generally might not be considered toxic when it's used within a group conversation. So as an example, one group discussed the need for freedom to share toxic content to build in-group solidarity through things like humor, for example, in an LGBT plus forum. Yet they also discussed the negative consequences to this approach if the same rules were applied to, for example, an extremist group, a group of white supremacists, for example. And there's been some real-world examples of this in how Facebook acted to override their moderation algorithms to allow content that would otherwise have been flagged for removal, this content being posts urging violence against Russian invaders. So in terms of the audience continuum, we identified we identified audiences that would potentially be which this type of intervention would potentially be quite effective for, but also audiences that this might be very ineffective for. So we sort of presented this on a continuum, with one end of the continuum being low intention users, so users that have low intention to cause harm, and on the other end of the continuum, users that have high intention to cause harm. So on the lower end, so these users may be sending harmful toxic content, but may be very unaware of its toxic nature. For example, using tropes or slurs without realizing their harmful meaning. And on the other end, we have those with high intention to cause harm. And these people are very aware, very determined, and very organized. And criminologists would refer to these people as sort of determined and organized offenders. And what we know from work that myself and colleagues conducted a few years ago, looking at communications within private instant messaging applications, that people, when interacting within these applications, they make errors and they send regretful messages that they later regret sending. And work by Sleeper and work by Wang has also showed this type of behavior in social media platforms and Twitter and Facebook. And so such an intervention might be very well suited to target these types of individuals, as well as those further down on the continuum, providing a mechanism to highlight potential harm prior to it being sent, i.e. to try and prevent those regretful messages from being sent in the first place. And with that, then it's important to note that this could then help to reduce the production of this type of content and reduce harm not just to the receiver, not just to the target of this type of content, but also to the sender. But the question that we had was then, could these types of interventions also be effective for those at the higher intention, these higher intention users? Well, what we see is some early work by Katsaros and colleagues around this type of moderation approach that suggests that there is a potential secondary benefit of these types of interventions. So less harmful content sent means fewer harmful messages that others see and reply to. And what this might mean is that targeting individuals at the lower end of the continuum, where it's more effective, may still indirectly impact on those at the higher end of the spectrum, because there are just fewer of these messages in circulation that people have the opportunity to respond to. So as I mentioned a bit earlier on, we are overly mindful that any intervention should be implemented with care. And to do this, we should look to understand not just what the potential positive impacts of these types of interventions are, but what also are some of the negatives impacts of these types of interventions, and how might, for example, those organized and determined users use or misuse these types of interventions. Participants discuss a number of ways in which such a system could potentially be open to abuse. The first was abusing for validation. I got validated, I'm being hateful, said moderator 2, who was concerned that this system could be used to validate harmful attacks made by others. There was also a concern for harmful negative gamification. So we sort of went into this thinking, well, actually, one way of trying to encourage people to send less harmful content is to perhaps place some gamification to the system, right? Turning the screen from red to green as a way of trying to encourage people to engage in a kind of way. And our participants picked up on this, and in their designs, they started to use things like measurement needles to indicate how toxic a message was. But then on the flip side of this, there was this concern that actually people could misuse this, and this could be used to actually negatively gamify an interaction. So producers said some people would actually relish this needle going up, or try and push this needle up as high as they could in order to show that they're being as toxic as they could. And we can already see here that there are potential ways in which we can start designing against this, right? So do we have this sort of very granular way of presenting the output of the model, or do we simplify it, right? Do we simplify it in order to prevent this type of negative gamification of the system, realizing that it may potentially have a negative impact on those that wouldn't have abused the system in the first place? And then finally, there were concerns that users would simply look for ways to circumvent the system. Like, how can I just find another way to share something that's hateful in a way that the system doesn't recognize, right? Learning the system, learning how the system responds, and learning how to circumvent the system. So we had a number of questions. So how do we make a usable system that purposely embeds an element of friction? And how do we present the output from a model to users without it being open to abuse? And what point during interaction might a moderation prompt be most effective? And so we developed a web-based app, a React-based web app that mimics 2 social platforms. So this mimics WhatsApp and it mimics Twitter. The platform incorporates, at the moment, the platform incorporates static content. And what this does is it allows us to perform an evaluation of our moderation prompts in a very controlled way, in a controlled environment. The system disables the user's inbuilt mobile device keyboard temporarily, just while they're using the app, and replaces it with our own. And what this does then allow us to do is to then start manipulating the keyboard in ways that we would otherwise be unable to do, for example, by disabling the keyboard. So we're planning to open source this environment. It's very easy to adapt, so you can very easily and quickly shift in and out different content. You can easily change the APIs that you're using for detecting toxic content, and it can be very easy adapted to start exploring other types of prompts. For example, misinformation prompts could be very easily incorporated within this type of system for some early understanding about how we might be able to design these types of interventions into a similar system. So our evaluation, which we're looking to release within the next couple of weeks, is looking to understand how these design variables will impact on the effectiveness of the intervention. So in particular, what we're looking at is friction. So we've got a high and low friction variable. We have a timing variable where we're either intervening on typing or on sending, and we have what we describe as an abstraction variable. So how are we presenting the output of the model to the user? Are we presenting this very binary output, or are we giving them more detail? And so what we're really looking to understand is, like, does that more granular output from the model change the way that people interact with the system, either in a positive way or potentially even in a negative way. So this is an example of one of our designs. So this is a low friction design. It doesn't stop the user from typing. It doesn't stop or impede the user in any way, and it occurs as the user is typing. So it just puts this information label, this prompt at the top of the keyboard. The abstraction here is high, so it doesn't report a percentage output from the model. It just says this content is inappropriate, which is quite different to this design. So this is still a non-typing intervention, so it still occurs as the user is typing, but here the friction is high. Okay, so here we're effectively disabling the keyboard for a set number of seconds, and we're giving them a specific, a much more granular understanding of how inappropriate or toxic their message is. So subtle differences, but well, apart from the disabling of the keyboards, but certainly within the text, very subtle changes. So those two examples were both examples of the user receiving the intervention as they are typing. This intervention is an on-send intervention, so the user is not impeded while they're typing, and the intervention only occurs after they press the respond button or send button. So again, this is high friction. So we've also built in we've also used time here to apply the friction. And again, the abstraction here is high. We just say this is this message is inappropriate without giving that granular output for the model. And we've got in total 8 of these different conditions that we're looking to test. So we're going to be randomly assigning users to a group, and then asking them to do a number of tasks, and looking to understand how these variations in the implementation of these prompts impacts on the way that the users respond. So we're at the point now where we're about to launch our evaluation. So I'm just going to talk briefly about what we're proposing to do for our evaluation, and at some point, once we've collected this data, we'll be presenting this in more detail. So yeah, look out for InfoSec talks, and future InfoSec talks, perhaps early next year, where we'll be presenting this work. So the way that we're proposing to evaluate this, so we've got two stages, so 2 broad stages. So the online platform is purely online. So this is an app that's running in Google as a Google App Service. And the first stage of this evaluation is what we call a free response stage. So we have developed a number of scenarios and a number of message threads, and we've gone through multiple iterations of evaluation of those scenarios and of those message threads in order to develop them. And in this stage, we are presenting those scenarios, we're presenting those message threads to our participants, and we're asking them to freely respond, in the hope that they will, or at least some of them will trigger one of the moderation prompts, and then we can then start to understand how the various different designs are impacting on essentially how they behave after receiving one of those moderation prompts. We're not expecting all of our participants to trigger one of these. We have created the scenarios and created the message threads in a way that we hope will most likely cause them to respond in a way that might trigger the moderation prompt. As a way of sort of mitigating that, we're we're looking to recruit quite a large number of participants. So we're looking to recruit around 1,000 participants for this particular study, in the hope that, you know, even if sort of 10% trigger response, we can then start to learn a little bit about these designs and about behavioral responses to these designs. And also another way to mitigate that is the second stage of our online study, which is a pre and post test. So here, different to the free response, we're actually providing them with a pre-written response that we know is toxic, and we're asking them to respond to a set of scales prior to the prompt being shown. Pre and post the prompt being shown. So we're essentially sort of even more sort of tightly controlling this. It reduces sort of the naturalistic aspect of the study, but it's a way of controlling it. So we know that each participant is going to be seeing exactly the same thing, and so we can then start to look to see what these we can look to start seeing how these different designs impact on their response. We're also collecting some usability evaluation data, and we're looking to understand how behavioral inhibitions may impact on how they're responding. So we're collecting that data and looking to do some rapid analysis of that data to identify what interesting cases. And then from identification of those interesting cases, then we're looking to do some inquiry-based interviews. So for example, if we see individuals who are receiving prompts and then increasing or retyping their message and increasing the toxic nature of their message, we want to understand why that's occurring. Similarly, if we're seeing people who are receiving prompts and their behavior is not changing, or their behavior is improving, we want to understand and start probing into exactly why they're responding in that way. And so for this, we're looking to run some inquiry-based interviews in order to probe into some of those questions and some of that data in a bit more detail. So so the question that drives me, just to sort of summarize all of this up, and to really sort of summarize my sort of agenda for my research in the foreseeable, is how can we inform the redesign of online social systems to foster kinder interactions. So what this study is still, from my perspective, is still a bit of a patchwork. It's still a bit of a plaster, right? We've got problems within these online social environments that have been built, and really this is still a bit of a plaster, a patchwork to try and address this problem. What I'm interested in is how we can start to rethink the design of these online social spaces. So, for example, we're seeing increased interest in social VR. How can we start looking at how these spaces, these social virtual reality spaces, are being fundamentally designed in order to try to reduce harmful behaviors occurring within these spaces, in order to foster kinder interaction. So, as an example, understanding how norms and behavioral norms are developing within these spaces is going to be really critical. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks so much, Mark, for a great presentation. Is there any questions from the audience, from anybody? Well, maybe I'll start. I have a question. So I think the things that you mentioned, with these designs, sort of in the last part of your talk. Correct me if I'm wrong. They sort of focus on specific users, like single users, right? So, but so we also know from, at least from our research experience, that a lot of yeah, I would say a lot of the issues that that we encounter online today with respect to toxicity, hate speech is maybe even coordinated from within and toward communities. And so does that, change the equation to some extent? How do you design for, community-based, let's say, possibly coordinated hate behaviors? Is that something that it's sort of orthogonal? Have you thought about it? No, sure. Just thinking off the top of my head.
Yeah. So I wonder whether that sort of touches on this idea of context. So we are seeing sort of generalized language models being applied, but do we need to start thinking about more community based language models that are specifically focused on identifying toxic content within specific communities, and excluding which will potentially then start excluding the detection of certain content within certain environments. So we had Rewire in a couple of weeks ago who were talking about this data set of labeled sexist comments, right? That's designed to be used to by NLP, ML people to develop models to detect sexist material. And this is great, but how would this work within a community of people who have been abused, where they're talking about their experiences and potentially using the same type of language that an abuser may use in order to talk about their abuse. And I think, in some ways, then these types of systems can have quite a negative impact, because they can start prompting people suggesting that content that they're typing is inappropriate where it's wholly not. So do we start? Yeah, so going back to this idea of context, do we need to start thinking about how we sort of move away from these sort of generalized models, and how we then start focusing on building more sort of localized models for toxic speech production and other forms of speech production?
No, that's, yeah, it makes sense. Do we have any other questions? Don't be shy.
So there's a question that's come into the chat. So how do you deal with challenges of complex language such as humor and sarcasm within the message type? So again, I think this again comes back to this idea of context. There are a number of different research strands that are trying to incorporate things like humor and things like sarcasm. Certainly sarcasm, as far as I'm aware, is extremely difficult to address within language models. So I guess my response to this would be that in some ways the proactive approach to moderation, so this proactive approach to moderation, it is in some ways addressing this because someone can just ignore the prompt, right? In reactive moderation systems, information could be taken down after it's been posted, and you'd need to then go through various different processes to try and challenge the takedown of that content. Whereas here, that isn't the case. And so I think that broadly helps to address some of the issues around misclassification of data. But I think these are real challenges, and I don't think, as I said in my presentation, I don't think many of the contextual or layers of context are really being appropriately addressed at the moment, and make these types of interventions really quite challenging. And then from a commercial perspective, it then sort of raises questions. So if you were Twitter or if you're Facebook, and you knew that these language models weren't detecting things like sarcasm and humor, and were generating false positives, that is not something that these companies would want to have operating within their platforms, because of the impact that it has on user experience.
I think there's another question on the chat.
Yeah, so this is something that was that we sort of captured within our design, within the design phase of this, which is around circumvention of the model. So I didn't go into all of the considerations of use, but the one that did talk about was this idea of circumvention. So could people then not even start replacing letters with numbers, but just start learning how the model works, right? Start building up a mental model of when or what words or what structure of sentences would result in the model detecting harmful content, or importantly, when it wouldn't detect harmful content, and then starting to adapt the way in which the user is typing based on that mental picture.
Great, thanks so much, Mark, for your presentation and the Q&A. We now move on to, last but not least, Arthur. Thanks so much, Arthur, for your time, for being here. So just a very quick introduction. Arthur has not officially joined UCL yet, but will soon, I believe. So he's still, I guess, at Imperial College. He's been doing a lot of work around blockchain security, ranging from Bitcoin, Ethereum, and he's done a lot of really great work around DeFi. He also has a MOOC on DeFi, defi-learning.org. So yeah, without further ado, Arthur, thank you so much. Please take it away.
Thanks a lot, Emiliano. Can everybody hear me and see my slides?
Yes, yes.
Okay, perfect. So today we're gonna dive a bit into the into attacks on decentralized finance, which is work with my amazing PhD students, as well as Roger Wattenhofer and Don Song. Before I'll give a brief introduction similar to what Emiliano just said. So I did my PhD at ETH Zurich in the information security group there. And my focus has been since 2012 really on Bitcoin, blockchains, and then later on Ethereum. So what really struck me somehow is that this is a very interdisciplinary field, right? So we need to understand and dissect the network layer, the hardware constraints, the consensus layer, the application layer, the game theoretic incentive mechanisms, economics, aspects of finance, and so on. So it really tries, I mean, it's really a very complex field that merges all these disciplines, and it's very hard to understand all of them perfectly. So we need to kind of make the best of what we can understand, and of what we can put together into a simplified model so that we can study it in our works. So I've been faculty at Imperial until the end of October. I actually have now 2 months off before I officially start at UCL in January, so which I'm very much looking forward to. I've been also now since this year affiliate faculty at UC Berkeley with Don Song, where we work a lot on this massively open online course on DeFi, where we have over 3,000 students learning DeFi with us. Currently it's the second iteration of the course, where we have also many invited speakers trying to bring as well industry collaborators on board to explain to students what DeFi is and how to apply it in real life. So the core of my focus on the research side is on building automated tools or trying to come up with automations to quantify security, to quantify optimality, as well as to perform measurements, such as measuring what people are doing, what is maybe suboptimal, what could be improved, what goes wrong, shedding light on the so-called dark forest that some of these blockchains are, where you have competitive trading among different actors. And yeah, I'm very lucky to have 4 really bright students that will continue working with me on also after my transition to UCL. Without them, this kind of work would definitely not be possible. All right, so regarding DeFi attacks or incidents, so I'm going to use this term interchangeably today. We have been looking at a real world data set of 180 attacks or 181 attacks, in which about $3.24 billion were lost. So the way that we gathered these attacks is by looking at public reports of the community, where there are various websites where users are trying to assemble information about attacks in a very informal manner. So we have been trying to collect these over the over the last year, but we covered a time frame of 4 years. So we started with attacks in 2018, and as you can see here on this plot, there were rather few incidents in 2018, but you can also see that there's more of a more of a density now in recent times in 2021, and we can definitely see that there's been kind of a spike in attacks, most likely due to the popularity of DeFi and the increased adoption that we have witnessed in general. So the research questions we're trying to answer is like, how can we try to systematically measure DeFi attacks? Because the reports out there that we have seen are lacking some scientific rigor. It's very difficult to define even an attack. So if anyone here has an idea of how to define the concept of an attack, I would be really curious to hear, because honestly, I don't know, right? I don't know how to define an attack, because there may always be the option to define or to describe a financial attack as arbitrage, which is considered benign. So we're not going to judge whether something is good or bad. We will call these outlier transactions or outlier events attacks, but yeah, maybe it's not the right term, right? So I would like to be a bit cautious on the word attack, even though I'm going to use it quite frequently in this talk. And regarding research questions too, given these incidents, given these attacks or these supposed lost funds, what can we do to learn from the experiences, right? So what kind of tools or strategies can we adopt to avoid that these are being attacked? Okay. So we're gonna start with a quick overview of this talk. So at the beginning, I'm gonna introduce a DeFi reference frame just to help us understand having the same language and the same system model. We're gonna look into an empirical analysis, and then we're gonna look into defensive solutions that we suggest, but that may definitely not be perfect, but complementary to what's out there at the moment. So regarding system model, a blockchain is made out of a stack of different components. Let's start at the bottom layer. So this is the network layer. What we have there is typically some sort of a communication medium that could be based on the internet, on TCP/IP, but it doesn't have to be. We have satellites out there broadcasting Bitcoin blockchain data, right? So which are likely not working based on TCP/IP. So there are various mechanisms on how you can communicate data, and the same applies obviously to blockchains then. So we still assume that there's some kind of a peer-to-peer overlay, some kind of a peer-to-peer discovery, etc., to propagate data efficiently in the network. Then the second layer is the blockchain consensus layer. So this is where you, for example, have a proof of work, lead election mechanism with then the longest chain rule to form consensus, or some sort of proof of stake systems, as well as an incentive protocol to incentivize users and participants to participate, right? If there's no incentive to participate, it's probably going to be a rather lonely blockchain. So there must be some kind of a reward for participating. We then have a smart contract layer. This is where you specify what language and what virtual machine is being used to execute so-called smart contract. A smart contract is not really like a contract in a regular sense. It's more like an app or a program that you can execute on this distributed, very slow and very expensive computer that's running on the chain, so to speak. And the beauty of this distributed machine is that we can have applications on top of it. And DeFi is one type of ecosystem that's made up of a set of applications such as exchanges, lending and borrowing, stable coins that you might have heard of, mixers, etc. Right? So these are all types of applications that can be instantiated on top of distributed ledgers. So one notable event, so to speak, in decentralized ledgers is that the community is very decentralized, or supposed to be decentralized, but somehow managed to agree on specific assets or token standards. So you have standards, for instance, for fungible or non-fungible tokens. So non-fungible tokens, for example, maybe you've heard of NFTs, are these flashy images like monkey images or so that you can purchase for horrendous amounts, while fungible tokens are typically some currencies, some native, so some new currencies that the community creates. So the system model wouldn't be complete if we would not consider also auxiliary services. So the user interface, so how users can interact with these systems, is quite crucial to security. There are oracles that aim to inject external data into the blockchain database, because the blockchain itself, for example, cannot query websites directly, right? There needs to be some sort of a protocol to communicate, and that's what typically oracles are there for. Okay, so this is just to have the same language and the same system model. Now, given the system model, we also shall consider a threat model, because we're speaking about attacks, and there wouldn't be any attacks without any threat model, so to speak. And what's notable is that we have two types of adversary goals. We have a monetary and we have a non-monetary adversary goal. So does anybody has an idea here, what could be a non-monetary adversary goal? Like, why would anybody be motivated without money as a return? Any idea?
Denial of service, disruption, that kind of thing.
So disruption, right? But what do you gain from a disruption? Are you just happy to break something, or what's the reward?
Going against competition.
Okay, but that's likely a financial reward, right? Because you have a vested interest that your competitors are being harmed, right? So one thing that we've observed is that some white hat hackers that are hacking DeFi applications, they do that just for fun, but not for profit, because they return the funds to the victim, and they just gain fame, for example, on Twitter. So there are these type of vanity motivated attackers out there. They care about recognition, apparently, right? They care about fame. So it's an interesting it's an interesting observation that some adversaries are not motivated by monetary gains. Regarding the public knowledge, so in our adversary model, we try to capture a variety of adversaries. Some that have public, that only have access to public information. So whatever you can also find on the chain, in the peer-to-peer networks, etc. An adversary may have stronger adversarial knowledge or capabilities of being a sequencer, for instance. So sequencers have access to privileged information. For instance, if users send transactions directly to a miner, then this data is not publicly readable, right? So it would be privileged access to information on which the sequencer can act. And you can have insiders, for example, developers of DeFi protocols may intentionally write bugs into their smart contracts and then later financially benefit by exploiting these, right? So this is an insider knowledge, so to speak. In our SOK that is accompanying this talk here, we have about 15 types of adversary capabilities. I don't want to bore you with all of these. Just to give you one example, maybe one example of an adversary capability could be to perform an eclipse attack. An eclipse attack is an act of partitioning a peer-to-peer network. So if we can represent a peer-to-peer network here as this circle, you partition it like maybe in the middle somewhat, that you then have two partitions and they don't know about each other. They don't know about what's happening in each of these partitioned networks, which is a very common threat in peer-to-peer and decentralized systems. So I mentioned that we have used community sources to collect our attacks. So more specifically, we looked at Rect News, Slowmist, and CryptoSec. We looked at both Ethereum and the Binance Smart Chain, as these are the most vibrant blockchains at the time of writing regarding the total value locked, so the total monetary amount that people have locked up in these chains. We find slightly more incidents on Ethereum, about 70 on Binance on the Binance Smart Chain. We then also looked into academic papers over the last 4 years. We extracted 78 academic papers from the top security conferences, but also from software engineering. Many of these papers are in fact attack papers. Some of them are security tools. We have also found 7 surveys or SOKs in that field. And then finally, to have a complete image, because we look at the attacks, we look at the academic papers, but then we also look at industry. What is industry doing? What kind of DeFi attacks or vulnerabilities is industry focusing on? So we've looked at 6 security auditing companies, and more specifically, there are 30 most recent audit reports. And the result of all this is this big table. So I know this is probably hard to read, so I'm going to try to go over this in a bit more high level. On the y-axis here, you can see the different system layers that we discussed at the very beginning of the talk. Do you remember we have the network layer, with the consensus layer, smart contract, protocol, and the auxiliary layer. And then depending on the layer, we have a cause of an attack, and then more specific types. Right? So this is kind of the taxonomy that we've tried to come up with. I have to admit, some of these are maybe a bit more subjective than others, but we've tried our best to kind of fit it into this taxonomy. On the top row, we have the academic papers that we looked at, so the almost 80 papers that we looked at, while here we have the 30 audit reports of the different companies that we have investigated. In this very last column here, we try to show the gap between the real world practice and academia and industry. And for example, here we can see that 24% of the attacks are apparently due to an absence of coding logic or an absence of a sanity check, right? So this seems to be one of the most important incident causes, so to speak. Just if we look at the number of incidents that we have had, right? We can also look at the number of papers. So for example, we find that 72% of the papers here focus on reentrancy. And I'm sure some of you have seen papers on reentrancy. We really have a plethora of papers actually discussing reentrancy. So this is a really widely studied issue in smart contracts. So reentrancy is one of the famous issues, and there was a DAO hack which caused an Ethereum fork, I think about 4 years ago, which was caused by reentrancy. So that may have contributed to the fact that this is so overstudied almost. So is there anything, like, just by looking at this table without really reading the details, is there anything that pops up in your mind that is striking?
The majority of the attacks are in the SC layer.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Mark. Right. So we can see here that there's really like the majority of the effort is being put both on the academic and the industry side, right? Really on this SC layer. Very little on the protocol layer, where DeFi attacks are actually occurring most of the time. So, and this is already informing us, right, that there's a gap between the attackers and academia and industry, because it would be very helpful to, for instance, look into more here. If you see here, this 15%, for instance, these are on-chain Oracle manipulation attacks. They're responsible for quite a few DeFi attacks, but there's very little effort, at least in the audit reports that we have seen, that those are being discussed. Okay, excellent. Yeah, similarly, there are a few works only on compromised private key wallets. Here we see that although 12% of the attacks are responsible, or whether private key compromises responsible for the attack are not being discussed very much in related works, nor the audit reports that we have investigated. Okay, perfect. So this is kind of like the reference frame, right? And now we're gonna move forward with a more fine-grained empirical analysis of past DeFi attacks. And specifically, we want to understand, so which type of DeFi protocol is vulnerable or is more or less vulnerable, right? So what's the difference among protocols, protocol types specifically? And we will discuss the feature that, the specificity of an emergency pause that some of these contracts implement. So in this table here, you can see on the top row, you can see different types of DeFi protocols. So yield means, for example, a yield farming protocol. A bridge is a protocol that tries to bridge between two blockchains, for instance, right? So it's kind of like an exchange, but it connects among two different databases. There are lending, decentralized exchanges, stablecoins, DAO, etc. So what's interesting here in the first, if you look at the first question, so what is the monetary loss related to the type of the DeFi protocol? We can see here that 22% of the losses are attributable to bridges and yield farming DeFi protocols. However, if we look at the number of security incidents that are related to the type of DeFi protocol, we can find that only 5% of the incidents are attributable to bridge protocols, while 22% of the losses are happening on bridges. So here we can infer that if there's an incident on a bridge, or if there's an attack on the bridge, the lost amounts are likely significant, at least higher than the incidence on the yield generator, according to our data. Okay, And the last question so here is the vulnerability type somewhat related to the type of the DeFi protocol? Here in red, I highlight now the protocol layer related vulnerabilities, and these are apparently rather high on the lending, the DEX, and the stablecoin DeFi applications. So in particular, stablecoins are really vulnerable, so to speak, on the protocol layer. It means we have really troubles to designing stablecoins, right? Many supposed to be stable coins have depegged, so they have lost their link, so to speak, to the currency that they should follow, whether that's the US dollar or something else. And in general, it's really hard to design these stable coins. Okay, so one defense mechanism that we have seen that these DeFi protocols can implement is the so-called pause button. So it's a function in the smart contract that for example, the protocol operator can call, and it would cease any operations that the contracts can perform. So it's really somewhat of an emergency pause mechanism. We've seen that roughly half of the protocols of our 181 protocols have implemented an emergency pause mechanism. And only 25 out of these 87 protocols have initiated the emergency pause within the first 6 hours of the attack. 6 hours on a blockchain or in any financial system is an eternity, right? So we understand that here, apparently, these protocols are not using any automated tools. They're not using any anomaly detection to detect attacks or to prevent attacks or to react to attacks. Right? So naturally, we can develop intrusion detection tools to automatically trigger, for example, the emergency pause. There's been one company that, like PackShield, who has been offering this now to the community. I'm actually very curious to also evaluate what's the cost of like false positives. So what happens if you pause the protocol like once a week because you have like false positives on the attack detection side? There must be some cost in terms of like reputation, trading friction, etc. So this is definitely super interesting future work. Okay, since we're already discussing some of the defensive solutions that exist, we're gonna dive into more future work defensive solutions that we could apply. So what can we learn from past attacks to strengthen DeFi security tomorrow? We're gonna discuss 3 possible avenues here. So the first thing is the rescue time analyzers. And this is an observation that here you have a timeline, and an attacker is in most of the cases, an attack is carried out by first deploying a contract. So this is a new contract that the attacker is going to use to execute the attack logic. Now, once the contract is deployed, the contract needs to be executed, right? So there's a function in that contract that will trigger the attack. And what we've observed is that some attackers deploy a contract, then wait a few minutes, and only then execute the attack. And that means we have here the opportunity as researchers, we could monitor, for example, deployed smart contracts. We could identify what's the purpose of a new contract. What does the contract do? And we could potentially identify, okay, this contract apparently is an attack contract. It apparently is attacking this other smart contract, and is using maybe this vulnerability, right? So if we have somewhat of a mechanism to automatically understand what a smart contract does, then we can definitely make use of these rescue time frames. Now, I may need to add that an attacker obviously can become smarter by batching the contract deployment and the attack execution. So if these are batched in a single atomic transaction, then this type of rescue time frame doesn't exist anymore, and we cannot use that time frame to prevent an attack. So just some more quantitative data. So we've seen that roughly 56% of the attacks of our data set are not executed atomically. So there's roughly a 50% chance that you can preempt an attack or pause your DeFi protocol if you were able to detect that there's an incoming attack happening. Okay, so one other method that we looked into is to compare victim and adversarial contracts. So to that degree, we performed a bytecode similarity analysis. So the input to this analysis is the EVM bytecode. So that's just the logic of a smart contract. We chop the EVM bytecode into n-grams. We vectorize the results, and then we perform a pairwise similarity between these different vectors. And this allowed us to compare, for example, so if we are considering 100% similarity among the victim contracts, we found 38 victim contracts in our data set. And if we consider adversary contract, we found 29 adversary contracts to be 100% similar, at least according to our methodology. So not we removed like parameters and so on. We really tried to focus on the pure bytecode that got executed here. And this is very preliminary work. I think this could be pushed quite a bit further in more dedicated works that focus on this topic, because this looks promising, and it seems that we can detect adversarial as well as vulnerable smart contracts, right? Also keep in mind, sometimes similar code pieces are being reused among blockchains even. So you may find the same vulnerabilities or the same attacks on different blockchains. Right. So the last point that we looked into is how many of these attacks that we have, of these 181 attacks, how many of these are being executed through so-called front-running as a service providers or flashbots. So these are intermediaries that relay privately a transaction to a validator or to a miner. So instead of going through the public peer-to-peer network where you broadcast a transaction, you can send them privately a message and they will relay it to the miner. They will not broadcast it anywhere else, right? So if your transaction is not successful, if it's not being mined, then it should not be shared, right? This is the rationale behind these services. And we found that 18 of these 181 incidents are being executed through these private networks. And moreover, 6 of the incidents that we've looked into are being accelerated by arbitrage trader. So these are traders that look at a transaction, they try to infer after this transaction is executed, what kind of arbitrage opportunities will there be? And that therefore they execute the attack, or they help execute the attack to profit afterwards from the arbitrage opportunities that are being created. So it's quite funny to see like arbitrage traders helping attackers to execute their attacks. So as a summary, we've seen that the network and the consensus layer incidents, as well as the protocol layer incidents, are understudied in related works. We've also found evidence that attackers appear to be specialized on a specific system layer, which kind of makes sense because a single layer like the consensus layer in isolation is already a very complex construct and a very complicated field of study, so to speak. We found that adversarial and vulnerable contracts that are similar are detectable through rather simple bytecode similarity metrics. And we also found that composability attacks are common. So this is where different DeFi protocols that interact with each other atomically are quite common, which is probably a bit less surprising for the community, but still interesting to confirm here in this work. So with that, yeah, I would like to thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks so much, Arthur, for your presentation. Let's open the floor for questions. You can unmute or raise your hand or use the chat. Don't be shy.
May I ask a question?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you, Arthur. That's very interesting to see that overview, and I think it's a very interesting space. Of course, I wondered if you can comment on what you kind of see as the direction of travel here. I mean, in some sense, you might expect that a field like this, where there was huge innovation in a very short period and the kind of Wild West feeling, it's kind of natural that there would be lots of attacks, but one might also expect that the field would somehow eventually reach a stage of maturity where the lessons have been learned and things have got calmer. Is that time arriving soon? What's your impression about that?
Yeah, that's a good question. The thing, what appears to be currently the case is that the information security practices are not that professional, right? So we have no automated tools to detect attacks in real time. We have no automated tools to prevent attacks in real time. Like monitoring in general is rather simplistic, based on heuristics, if at all. This is I see first papers popping up in that direction, but most focus has really been on smart contract auditing, and there's been a tremendous effort on that. And so I would say on the smart contract auditing side, the efforts are really professional, but apparently they're not enough, right? And security is always about defense in depth, right? So we need to have multiple layers where we can defend, so that the attacker needs to hop through all these layers to eventually be successful. And I think this is just, I mean, we know this from traditional information security. So this is, I suppose, because you're asking about the future state, I suppose this is what's going to come about. We will just need multiple layers of defenses with multiple validity or fraud checks and balances, and then the space can become more welcoming, so to speak, to less risk averse entities. Yeah.
Great, thanks. Okay, maybe I'll ask a question. So, we followed I followed the news more or less online about fluctuations, big fluctuations on market value, market caps, and market values of coins or NFTs dropping. So how does that, do you think, affects the overall ecosystem also of DeFi? Is that something you can comment on?
Definitely. I mean, for instance, there has been a tremendous volatility in the NFT markets, for instance, right? In the interest, but also the trade volume of NFTs. So from an economic perspective, I'm obviously not an expert there, so I can't really judge whether that's a bubble or not, or whether it's good or bad. But it's interesting how cryptocurrencies go through these cycles, where we do have the so-called bear and bull markets. In some cases, these cycles are interesting because they boost certain activity, and they inhibit other activities. So overall, I think it's healthy that both exist, right? Like always having a bull would probably be quite stressful to many people. I feel like there's overall more time to build and more time to think when there's less craze, so to speak, which is quite quite nice as well. Yeah, there are pros and cons, but I guess life is a roller coaster anyhow, right? So, so yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks. Do we have any other questions? If not, let's thank our speakers again. Arthur, Mark, and Anna, thank you so much. So we can take a few minutes break. We're running a little bit behind schedule, but maybe we can take a 5-minute break, comfort break, as they say, and then we can start back with Sharad and the student-led sessions. Thank you so much again.
Welcome everyone back from the small break, and thank you for being around to listen to our wonderful PhD students. My name is Sharad, and I'm a PhD student working with Dr. Marie Vasek and Professor Stephen Murdoch. I'll be just simply chairing the session. So our first speaker for today is Jennifer. Jennifer is a second-year PhD student at Cybersecurity CDT, focusing on distributed ledgers and privacy. So Jennifer, please share your screen.
Hi, good, yeah. Hi, my name's Jennifer. I work with Dr. Stephen Murdoch. I'm going to talk a bit about electronic evidence and how that's treated in courts and how system design changes can help address some problems. So first, in England and Wales, courts presume that for electronic evidence, the computer that produced it was working at the given time. This is to prevent sort of lengthy investigations into every piece of electronic evidence that needs to be presented. If every text message, email address, every piece of data that's sent, it needs to come with accompanying proof that the computer was working, these things would take forever. So imagine every DUI case, the breathalyzer test results need to go through a process of proof that the breathalyzer was working. These processes would take forever. So proving correct behavior, aka reliability, is not as easy as saying, yes, it's working or no, it's not. They're complicated pieces of equipment, and issues can, there can be errors in small places that cause big effects, or big errors may not cause any effect whatsoever. And therefore, proving unreliability is also incredibly difficult, which means that trying to come up against this presumption means that you have some that can cause some issues. And especially because in a high pressure legal setting, the party trying to question a system's evidence is not the party that provided it. They may not have access to the required information or have the necessary expertise to start assessing the system. So an example of this is the Horizon post office scandal, which some of you may remember. Horizon is the accounting software that the post office used to keep track of all of their sales systems, all of their money, all of their various assets. So from sort of the 1990s, hundreds of post office employees were charged with theft and fraud based on evidence produced by the system. The accounting system detected shortfalls of sometimes thousands of pounds, which based on a contract, the post office employee was therefore responsible for making up. And this is quite a lot of money. And sometimes these people would either refuse to pay or couldn't pay. And therefore they were charged with various different crimes. And they were often accused because they were put in a position where it was impossible to overcome that presumption. They didn't have the resources, the equipment, or the knowledge to go up against Horizon. And the post office was in a position to be entirely unhelpful. They could withhold all the necessary information, like the known error logs, that could have helped these people's cases. So there are some solutions, and obviously changes to how the legal system treat electronic evidence does need to be made. The considerations in how to treat evidence are being considered, but this sort of project is focusing on how to better design systems to produce the information required in a low cost, low burdensome way. And it will mostly focus on point of sale sort of accounting systems, a bit like Horizon, that focus on exchanging goods for money. And yeah, so first, asset tracking. So nuclear waste systems are considered safety critical, which means that they handle, like they need to any failure on their part would result in severe damage, cost, loss of life, that sort of thing. And detecting and resolving an issue is pretty similar to just detecting an issue. And for these sorts of systems, we don't need to prevent the issue from happening. We just need to detect that it has happened. So these sort of techniques can be used in a point of sale system. So every object is treated as its own asset, is given its own identity and its own lifespan, which is monitored and recorded. This data is stored in like immutable blockchains where it's tamper evident. Each block contains all the information of the block before it, and it's append only, tamper evident, and it will store in a sort of safe and immutable way. This brings up the concept of fungibility, which is the ability of a good or asset to be interchangeable with another good or asset of the same type. All copies of the same item in a shop, for example, a copy of the book Pride and Prejudice, is the same as any other copy. They're considered fungible with each other. But that's not a constant value. It can change over time. So once you've bought an item, it's considered your item and it's no longer fungible with any unsold items. For example, if you buy a bike from a store, maybe you change the seat, you scratch the paint, it's no longer interchangeable with the items in the shop. I'm just proposing that we take where you apply non-fungibility and just give it to the item before it's sold. Now, this brings up the double spend problem. So not having a stock total doesn't mean, it means that now each item needs to, each node in a system needs to know what's happened to each item. So if one till sells a copy of a book, an individual copy, every other register needs to know not to sell that given copy. So this is fixed by like a distributed ledger, which is how cryptocurrencies solve a double spend problem. Every network stores a copy of the data. In this case, it's every computer in the network stores a copy of the data. In this case, it's the data, it's all the blockchains of each object for sale. Once an action is taken place, that's broadcast across the whole network, and all nodes participate in a consensus mechanism to agree on what the state of that data is. And then that way there's a history of what's happened on this system, which is the ledger itself. It records every action that's ever occurred on the system. I won't describe how consensus works because I don't really have the time for that, but it basically polices actions once it happens. So to quickly evaluate how effective this system is, there are sort of three scenarios I'm going to talk about that happened in Horizon, which was causing the shortfalls, and how my system kind of fixes those errors. So the first one is objects being moved around and duplicated. So a book of stamps being moved from a storeroom into the main shop resulted in 2 books of stamps being created. One was a duplicate of the other. This doesn't happen in this sort of system because each object is non-fungible. It's given its own identity, its own life. Duplication of ID numbers will be flagged and detected as an issue, and it will not be accepted by a consensus mechanism. And remembering the fact that we don't need to prevent these sorts of things from happening, only prove that they are happening and they're occurring, which is easier than having to solve the problems entirely. The next issue is how the same action occurring twice. This is where an employee tried to perform a transaction to sell something, the system crashed and they restarted and the same action was logged twice, but it only occurred once. This is the double spend problem, which I've already explained is solved by the consensus mechanism. The nodes don't agree on logging the same action done twice. This error can be detected and flagged. And finally, the lack of consistency. So Horizon isn't just one system. It's made of multiple old accounting systems, new databases, new pieces, all pieced together. Actions sometimes can be logged in one location and not in another. So a transaction made in Horizon might not have transferred over to the accounting system. This is where the distributed ledger offers better transparency. Any node participating in the consensus will have all the information required to participate. If the consensus doesn't agree, it's known by all. If an action happens, it will be easily replicated across the whole network. And also adding new pieces is fairly easy to do, as blockchain structures are easily duplicated and verified and stored. So in summary, there is a need to redesign some systems to prove that to better provide evidence. And there does also need to be some changes to the legal presumption. However, systems can be better designed to treat each to help prevent these sorts of issues from happening. So the non-fungible object data protects against duplication, as well as offering high assurance and traceability for each and every object. This is going to be used in like supply chains and stuff like that. The distributed ledger then does the double spending, as well as policing all actions that occur in the system. Yeah, thank you for listening. That's it from me. Yeah.
Thanks, Jennifer, for the presentation. So considering the time limitation, we'll take all the questions at the end. So the next speaker is Ashley Fuller. Ashley is a second-year PhD student at the Crime Science Department, working at the intersection of social policy and technology, specifically on the effects of social media on drug markets and young people. So Ashley, please share your screen.
Yep, I'm on it. Give me a second. Okay, so I'm finding some difficulties that didn't happen yesterday when we trialed this. So let me come back.
I think till the time Ashley is back, we can go to the next speaker. So the next speaker is Maria, who is a third-year PhD student at the cybersecurity CDT at UCL, studying cryptography that is secure against both classical and quantum computers. So Maria, please feel free to go ahead and share your screen.
Can everyone see that? Is it all shared?
Okay.
Yeah, it's good.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, yeah, so thanks for the introduction and for having me. I'll be talking about cryptography in the age of quantum computers. So first of all, what is cryptography? Well, there are three main purposes of modern cryptography. The first one is integrity, so ensuring that your messages are not altered when they're being sent. Confidentiality, which ensures that your message stays private when it's being sent over like an insecure channel. And then you have authenticity, which ensures that you're talking to the person who you want to talk to. So if you're talking to like Amazon online, then you can be assured that it's the right person. And I mainly focus on confidentiality. So how can we keep messages private? The key sort of example or building block for this is key exchange. So this is when you have two parties and they want to talk over a public channel, but they don't want to send their messages in the clear because this wouldn't be secure. So what they do is they have some conversation and they agree on some shared secret. And then they use this shared secret key to start a private conversation where they can use this key to encrypt their messages. And it's used to build a lot of more like advanced schemes. So things like TLS, the Signal protocol, and WireGuard, which is a secure VPN. So one of the most widely used key exchanges is the Diffie-Hellman key exchange, which most of you probably already know of. And its security is based on the hardness of this very mathematical problem, so the discrete logarithm problem, which just asks, given you have this group G, which is the multiplicative group mod P, and you have some generator, and you're given an element of this group, say H, and you're asked to find the X such that G to the X is equal to H. So why does this, why does a key exchange have anything to do with this problem? Well, normally public keys, the public key of the parties will be your H, and then your private key will be the X. And then the hardness of this problem basically ensures that if you know the public key, then you can't actually find the private key. So lately, there's been a lot of research into quantum computing, and there's been a lot of investment and a lot of, I guess, breakthroughs in quantum computing. There's a whole media frenzy around it, I guess, and there have been a lot of advances. Quantum computers are still not super efficient, and they're very error prone, but there have been advances, and I think like billions of dollars are going into developing these computers. And the problem is that quantum computers can easily solve the discrete log problem. And not only that, they can also solve the problem that underlies things like RSA and elliptic curve cryptography. So basically all cryptography that we use nowadays is broken by quantum computers. So if they ever become efficient, then we're kind of in a sticky situation. So we can secure ourselves by using post-quantum cryptography. And this is a cryptography that's secure against quantum computers, but you can implement them on classical computers. And the idea behind this is that, well, not everyone is going to have access to quantum computers, especially in the transition period where, they're going to be big and expensive to run. So we really want to be able to use classical cryptography, so cryptography that you can use on your laptops or on your phones, to protect against both quantum and classical computers. There are 5 main families that were submitted to this post-quantum competition held by NIST. And these families just correspond to different hard problems which the security is based on. First one is lattices, so finding short vectors in a big lattice. Second one is isogenies, which is the one that I work on. Then you have codes, so like coding theory, multivariate equations, which means solving large systems of multivariate equations, and hash functions, so collision resistance and like pre-image resistance of hash functions. So I work on isogenies, and this type of cryptography is very young, and so its security is still unknown. Well, there's been some work on it, but it's definitely not as well established as the other 4, which means there's a lot of exciting research going on, and it's important to study it and see how secure it is. It has a problem that it's quite slow, though efficiency can come with research. Like the more attention you have on a protocol, the more efficient it will get because more people are working on it. And it has a really nice property that it has really, really small keys. It rivals elliptic curve cryptography when it comes to key sizes. So people are thinking about using it for IoT devices, for example. So just to go very quickly through just the basics of what isogeny crypto is, you have an elliptic curve that in cryptography, we look over finite fields, and it's given by this equation. So y² equals to some cubic. And the reason why it's really cool for cryptography is that it forms a group, and the group is given by adding points on your elliptic curve. And this allows you to do a lot of nice operations with it, and why people use it for cryptography. And then an isogeny is just a map between 2 elliptic curves that preserves this nice group structure. The reason why we care about isogenies is because, well, the really useful property about elliptic curves is that they form a group. So if we're looking at maps between them, then we want maps that preserve the group structure. And it just has a fancy name, which is isogenies. But that's all it means. They're nice maps between elliptic curves. They're given by nice formulae, so they're efficient to compute if the degree of your map is smooth. And for example, this is what a degree 3 isogeny looks like. So as you can see, it's quite efficient to compute. So the hard problem, sort of the analog of the discrete logarithm problem in isogenies, is given 2 elliptic curves, find the isogeny between them. And this is thought to be hard for both classical and quantum computers. And the reason why is if you look at this as a graph, so your nodes are the elliptic curves, in your graph, and then the edges are isogenies between your elliptic curves, then the graph of constructed in this way is actually Ramanujan, which means that it has optimal expansion. And that, like, intuitively just means that everything mixes very rapidly. So if you take a short walk in the graph, you kind of land at a random node. And that's why, given two nodes, it's like very hard to find a path between them. And the best attack is the Stieltjes-Galbraith attack, which is actually what I've mostly been looking at, which solves this, which finds an isogeny between two elliptic curves by walking in this graph until you reach a special subset in the graph. And then the problem is just easier to solve in this special subset. So it kind of reduces the big problem to an easier problem. And the bottleneck is sort of this reduction where you're walking until you find your special subset. So in joint work with Craig Castell and Jia Shi, we implemented this attack to determine its concrete complexity, which is really important if you want to determine like the parameters that you're going to use. So the asymptotic complexity of this attack was known, but to choose precise parameters, you need to know like what the constant is in front of your sort of asymptotics. So we determined this concrete complexity, and the main contribution was actually improving on the concrete complexity of the attack. So we found a better way to detect the special subset as you walk in the graph to cover a bigger proportion of the graph at each step. And here are just some data. So for like a 50-bit prime, we actually improved by a factor of 3. The middle two are cryptographic size primes, so 250 bits, 500 bits. We got sort of a 3 to 4 bit reduction on the security. And then for a big prime, like say 800 bits, we improved by a factor of 19. And this improvement increases with the prime because our detection actually doesn't depend on, like its efficiency doesn't depend on the prime. So actually the bigger the prime, the better it is to do like our special detection. And yeah, if you want to find out more about the paper or you know, this algorithm, then we have the preprint out. It was published in Crypto, so you can also see the published version. Or I've given talks on this, which you can see on my webpage. And I guess questions will be at the end. So yeah, if you have any, feel free to ask. Thank you.
Thanks, Maria, for the talk. So yeah, we'll have questions at the end. So just making sure we don't run out of time. So Ashley, I guess you should be able to connect back now.
Yes, apologies for that. So does everyone see my screen? Does that work?
Not yet.
Ah. Okay.
Yeah, all good now.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, apologies for that. Is it really a Zoom meeting if someone doesn't mess up? Yeah, so I'm Ashley. I'm a second-year PhD student at the Jill Dando Institute for Security and Crime Science, and I'm funded by the Dawes Center for Future Crime. So my supervisors are Enrico Mariconti, Mary Pasek, and Professor Shane Johnson. So I'm just going to walk you through very, very quickly on my research, and specifically my first research project, which is systematic review. So my research is on drugs on social media. Even though most of the drugs online are bought through the darknet, they actually, a proportion of them have shifted to the clear web, to social media. And this is very concerning because it's very accessible, especially to young people. So one research in 2019, led by a think tank, found that 1 in 4 young people have seen this content, drugs advertised on social media, and 36% of them thought that it wasn't concerning, it wasn't a problem. So this is This is concerning because young people see purchasing drugs through social media as a form of harm reduction because it's more secure. You don't have to meet anyone in the sort of kind of typical in the street or in the backstreet alley. And this also makes it more easy than going on the dark web because built-in features from social media allow dealers to professionalize their selling business and make it more appealing, as you can see on the screenshots. So there is not a lot of research on this issue. It's quite recent, and it's difficult to detect because a lot of dealers use emojis and different wordings to obviously bypass detection. There's also a lot of kind of migration through different platforms. So what happens is that drugs may be advertised on one platform, for example, Instagram, and then they'd make contact with a dealer and then go through private discussions on encrypted platforms. So there's also not a lot of cross-national evidence on this phenomenon from different countries. Most of the research, little research, is in UK or in US. And it is important given the recent developments on the online safety bill, where research is crucial to advise regulators or service providers. So what did I do? I led a systematic review in order to gather more systematically, reliably existing data, to expose the gaps in the research and to generate future research questions. So my research questions were, firstly, to establish the state of the literature on the sale of drugs through social media and try to really understand how did that advertisement vary across countries and platforms. We also were interested in looking if there were any methods of prevention that exist or that could be implemented. So the data that we were kind of looking for within the papers, within the literature, was various. So I won't go through all of it in terms of time, but we were looking at things such as prevalence or exposure rates, the type of keywords used, obviously the drugs, and things like what methods of detection or prevention were studied. So we started with about 4,000 records and screened through all of the papers through different disciplines and ended up with 63 included records. So in terms of the inclusion criteria, we were looking specifically at drugs advertised on social media, not at different types of illicit goods such as firearms or anything. And also, we were more focused really on advertisement of drugs and not the use of social media for public health surveillance, which was very common in the literature. So very quickly, there were 53 peer-reviewed included studies spanning from 2015 to 2022, including 18 countries and across 8 different disciplines. So again, I'll pinpoint some of the results in the interest of time. So the first one, the papers looked at 300 unique drugs, but opioids and cannabis represented about 40% of the total drugs researched in the studies. I also found that actually those studies could be categorized into 4 main groups. So the first one, which was the most prevalent, there were the most papers on this, were papers that were looking at how to detect drug advertisements and what patterns do they show. Other papers looked at drug markets on social media platforms, others at users. So what were the characteristics or motivations of buyers or sellers? And very few papers looked at prevention methods. So obviously the detection pattern kind of papers were more from the computer science, were more quantitative in nature, or also mostly from the US. And the rest actually had a greater kind of intersection between disciplines and methods as well, but mostly qualitative. So as I said, most of the research was on detection using computational methods and machine learning techniques. And what was interesting is that I found that there was a move within the years from detecting solely keywords referring to drugs to actually detecting behavior, drug selling behavior. And so here you can see that actually, if we talk about the four categories that I mentioned before, the detection kind of papers come in earlier and actually touch upon this issue earlier than other research. So the implication of this is that for better performing algorithm, there needs to be an integrated approach to detection that takes into account behavior. And by behavior, I mean that recent models actually integrate different sources of data, and they use all that in their model to predict drug selling behavior, such as hashtags. They use comments, bioinformation, and look at the interaction between all these elements. Also, there was a lot of disparity in terms of the platforms researched. So for example, Twitter and Instagram were vastly overrepresented, whereas research on Discord and TikTok only were looked at this year. There was only a paper. Now, of course, acknowledge that this is also due to methodological kind of differences, but it was striking that, especially for TikTok, that is used mostly by young people right now, there's no research and we don't know on anything of the content on how much drugs and drug advertisements there may be. So this highlights the importance of carrying out diverse and coordinated research on all these different platforms. So very briefly, the main takeaway points is that as advertisements are becoming more complex, they try to bypass those moderation algorithms, and also drugs are becoming differentiated. We found that there were also different ways of presenting advertisement if you trying to sell study drugs rather than party drugs. So I guess this echoes to Mark's presentation that we need to kind of proactively approach detection. The second implication is carrying out diverse research on various platforms, as I mentioned. There was also kind of a focus on prevalence. And yes, this is the content on social media advertising drugs is very low, but not a lot of papers looked at their exposure. So especially on TikTok, it might be very few videos, but their reach is very high. And finally, there's a need to design and evaluate prevention strategies, as there were not a lot of studies on this, and they relied on kind of self-reported measures of campaigns. So very briefly, what I plan to do in the next steps of my PhD is I'm with my supervisory team with a working group led by the drug education charity Daniel Spargo Mabs and other stakeholders. So we already kind of fed the systematic review to Ofcom's call for evidence. So Ofcom is going to be the regulator for the online safety bill. And we are looking to carry out a survey. So to follow up on a survey that the foundation did in 2020, to survey students across the UK, possibly cross-nationally, to really understand if there's a relationship, or to dig deeper whether the exposure to this content has an effect on their perceptions of risk and on their drug buying behavior. And also possibly we'd like to experiment on messaging, how to encourage young people to report these advertisements on social media. So yeah, thank you again for inviting me to talk, and I guess take questions later.
Thank you, Ashley. Moving on to the next presentation, it'll be done by Georgi, who is a third-year PhD student at UCL, researching on the intersection of machine learning and privacy, with an emphasis on differential privacy, generative models, and evaluation techniques. So, Georgi.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh yeah, okay. So yeah, thanks so much for having me, and yeah, thank you so much for the, for the patience, and being, staying that late, and maybe like thinking about lunch now. So I'm going to be presenting some of the effects that differentially private mechanisms have on synthetic data, and most of this work is, of course, common work with my advisor Emiliano. Okay, so to start with, well, let's see what the problem setting is. And our goal is to create synthetic data through a generative model, which is privacy preserving. Why we want to do this? Well, maybe because we want to, share that data with someone internal in the company, but we have some restrictions there. Maybe we want to, share that data with third parties, to test our, to test them like their solutions, and so forth, and so forth. Okay, so if we do this, is this enough? Like, is our problem solved? Is the data just private automatically? Well, the answer is no. And there just, there's a lot of studies saying that, well, those models, be it generative models or, even discriminative models, they can overfit, they can, memorize training data points, and that's not private. And there's just a couple of examples from Emiliano's papers there. So we can't do this. And what's the state of the art currently in academia is to train those models with differential privacy. Okay, so we're going to be doing differential private generative models. But let's start with the question, what is differential privacy? It's interesting that, we survived so far without anyone mentioning this. So I'm going to explain this super quickly. Differential privacy is basically a definition, which allows us to train models free of assumptions in a way that basically through differentially private mechanisms, they basically limit the how much all of the data points contribute to the final computation. So if we train two generative models here, one with Alice and one without Alice, the output of that computation, which is the trained model, that would be kind of undistinguishable from each other. And this is how we defend, how we prove the privacy of Alice here, for instance. Okay, so we decided that we're going to be training generative models with differential, that satisfy differential privacy. Now, let's say, our next question will be, okay, but then, which generative model to use? Well, that's kind of a loaded question, and it kind of depends on many things. Just, a list with some of the things that, we have identified so far that are important factors. And I'm going to super quickly present two papers that I have on this topic that, look into, a subset of those factors. So the first one is looking at the disparate impact that differential privacy has on synthetic data. And yeah, that's a paper that got accepted earlier this year at ICML. Okay, so our goal here is to empirically evaluate and analyze the disparate effects of those models vis-a-vis underrepresented classes and subgroups in terms of the size and accuracy. And I'm going to show what that means, in a second. For this particular study, we looked into three, state-of-the-art generative models with different differentially private mechanisms. If you want to find more about them, you can look into the paper. But yeah, the first research question here was, do those models create data in similar classes, proportions as to the real data? And the answer is no. And as you can see here, so yellow here means, as you can see here, it was the minority. In the real data, blue was the majority in the real data. And here, I guess I'm missing the x-axis, but this is we have more stronger privacy guarantees. So the more privacy we add for this model, for pre-base, it kind of balances the data, whereas this model here, Patagon, increases the imbalance. And what we, how we talk about those things is that pre-base is kind of the Robin Hood of generative models, and Patagon exhibits macho effects. And here we do the same exercise, but we have multi-class data. And again, those bigger circles means that they have more counts in the snake data than in the real data. quickly moving to our next research question, it was if we train classifiers on the synthetic data as opposed to training a DP classifier on the real data, does those things lead to similar effects? And in short, yes. That was not unexpected, I believe. But what is worse with generative data or with synthetic data is that we're getting kind of, everybody gets poorer in a way. So as you can see here, the minority classes, which is again the yellow lines, they were having like less utility to start with, but then when you add differential privacy, things get even worse. So for kind of private settings here, when epsilon is 0.1, you can see how the drop of utility for those underrepresented groups is much larger, and you can kind of observe this here as well. Lower, size of the group, lower utility. Yeah, which is unfortunate, and there's currently research to try to tackle those problems. So we decided to play with the imbalance levels as well, and that's a big factor as well. It could be seen here. I believe that so the higher the imbalance, those effects that we're just discussing in the past two research questions, they get even even larger. And I have only 3 minutes left, so I'm swiftly moving to my next paper, which is currently under submission. But here our goal was to actually analyze how the different models spend their budgets and see what is the impact on the underlying task. So yeah, that was basically the first part of the paper. The second part was to take some of those effects that we were discussing before and see what's going on. Here we added one more model, which is this MST model, which is currently thought about as one of the best models there. And yeah, here we're adding a lot more experiments to kind of up our game. So yeah, first of all, we wanted to see how scalable are those generative models when we increase the dimensions of the data. And I guess no surprises here, but those graphical models, so pre-based and MST graphical models, they kind of suffer from the curse of dimensionality, which means that they cannot scale to too many columns. This is the number of columns, whereas the GAN models kind of okay, like they don't care too much about that. Up to maybe like we've seen that in images that it's completely fine. Okay, next question will be so how those models under the hood actually distribute the privacy budgets. And no funny picture here, but it kind of makes sense that the underlying the underlying modeling of those different generative models, it is kind of the same as the scalability. So the graphical models spend their budget horizontally. So the more columns you have, like you need to distribute their budgets to those columns independently. So that's how they kind of, let's say, like lose utility. Where the GAN model, they do that per iteration. So more data you have per each iteration, you need to add some noise. And yeah, and next we're going to observe to observe what's the effects on the downstream task. And here we've run a lot of experiments. I'm going to display just one picture, but there are a lot of mixed effects there. One thing that we can observe is that for the graphical models in this graph here, when we have more data points, but we have fixed the dimensionality, we can see how more data kind of increases the utility. And that dotted line here is the real value that we're trying to achieve. And that effect is kind of, monotonic. When we increase the dimensionality, it's the opposite effect. So monotonically, our utility goes down. Interesting effect is that here, if we have limited data, adding some degree of privacy actually helps the utility, which I guess here happens only when we're using the Gaussian mechanism. And for the GAN models, they're kind of a bit more unexpected, and their behavior is a lot more variable and not monotonic. And I'll stop here. And yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you, Georgi. Sorry for stopping you, considering the time we have. So yeah, our last student speaker here is Killian, who is a final year PhD student studying anonymous communications, in particular anonymous collaboration, as well as general web privacy. So Killian, go ahead.
Hi, thanks. So this is privacy preserving crowdsourcing of HSTS data for Tor Browser, and this is work I've done with Dan Riesta and Stephen Murdoch as well. So first of all, what is HSTS? You may or may not be familiar. It's a HTTP header, which gets sent by a server when you connect, and it simply says, always enforce HTTPS from now on. So if you receive this header and you subsequently visit that site, your browser enforces HTTPS, it cannot load an insecure site. And this obviously reduces man-in-the-middle attacks and is generally good. It also has an expiry time, you can see here in seconds, which gets refreshed every time you visit the site. And it's currently used by about the top 20% of, popular sites in general. The problem, though, is that it's used for tracking. So any malicious tracking website can include sort of many tracking pixels and then selectively activate HSTS on those bits. And then when you revisit that site, your browser sort of dutifully reports this HSTS data back, and then you can be identified by this unique identifier. Moving to Tor Browser actually disables HSTS by default to prevent this tracking, which is typical of Tor Browser, which unfortunately though loses out on the security guarantees of HSTS. So we have developed a protocol that actually sources HSTS data from many users, and actually means that hopefully all users of Tor Browser will sort of somewhat share HSTS data, meaning that the tracking utility is just completely eliminated. And for that, we use an adaptation of Rapport, which is a privacy-preserving data aggregation protocol, which you might have heard of. Rapport is relatively simple. It uses randomized response to introduce differential privacy, and it sort of encodes submissions into a Bloom filter and introduces random perturbations into that data to add differential privacy. Bloom filters quickly are a probabilistically correct sort of set data structure where we have an n-bit set. We want to insert, we hash the website we want to insert, we get a binary data that's equivalent to a number. We get the modulo of the size of our set, which is 5. We set bit 5, and that counts as a set insertion. And then similarly to query membership, we do the same thing. This time it's bit 3. We say is bit 3 set. If bit 3 is not set, the item is definitely not in the set. But if bit 3 is set, the item is probably in the set. Because there's no way of actually representing all possible data in this very small data structure. It has an inherent false positive rate, which increases as more items get added into the set. For our purposes, though, we're also counting not just whether something is inserted, but the number of times. So in fact, these bit values are actually integer values, but get incremented on each insert of a website. So we have this data and we want to distribute it amongst Tor Browser clients. And Tor already has a system for this via directory servers, so we can distribute the data periodically to different users. And this will be a data blob containing actually 2 separate Bloom filter datas, which, depending on the setup of the system, the size of this is variable, but probably about 32 kilobytes, which is not too much. So when a user actually loads the website, well, first of all, they attempt to load the website in the background. We first of all do a check to the local Bloom filter data. We want to check how many times that website has been inserted to the filter by other users. And if this is above a certain threshold, we kind of assume that, yes, this website has been sufficiently reported as having HSTS, which means that we now have to force a HTTPS connection on our load of example.com. Otherwise, if it doesn't appear in the set, we just disregard, load the website as normal. Then subsequently, if that site reports HSTS to us, we then want to include that in the protocol and report that to the Tor directory server. For privacy guarantees, each bit is perturbed according to privacy parameters P and Q, which between 0 and 1. And basically, we start off with our Bloom filter that we're reporting, and we perturb that zeros get falsely reported as ones at probability P, and ones get falsely reported as a 0 at probability Q. So obviously, depending on these parameters, the data gets more noisy and you get more privacy. And then you get our differential privacy epsilon according to P and Q here. The problem, though, with this is that it's inherently very vulnerable to denial of service. Any user can just report false data for any site. And if that site doesn't have HTTPS, users will be blocked from accessing the site, which is not good. So instead, we also decided to report sites that have HTTP only. So we're recording sites that have HSTS, but we're also reporting sites that can't have HTTPS. And this means that after detecting HSTS in a site through a data set, we then also check if that site has been registered as having no HTTPS. And by definition, sites without HTTPS can't have HSTS. So if a site appears in both of these data sets, something has gone wrong. Either it's maybe a collision or it could be malicious behavior. And so we can just maybe warn the user, say something fishy is going on, but we don't restrict their access to the site. We don't introduce any warnings or any difficult warnings. The last thing is expiry of HSTS, as I said, has an expiry time. And so to tolerate this, we actually store 2 months of data at once, and we work on a month-by-month basis. And so we're actually always storing these 2 months. Whenever we write to this data structure, we only store in the current month, but we also read from both months when we're reading data. And then at the end of any month, the current month's data becomes the previous month's data, and the current month is then reset to a fresh data set. And this means that if any server administrator disables HSTS, this will actually drop out of the protocol after 2 months, because that's a necessary part of HSTS. So the results of this, the accuracy of the protocol is based entirely off the number of submissions. So if you're dealing with a set amount of websites, the more submissions you have, the more accurate it is, the less false positives you have, and the more HSTS sites that you can actually accurately detect. And we're assuming for this to work that it will be widespread in Tor Browser, and given the current Tor usage stats, we can accurately report on about 10,000 websites. It's a limitation that, you know, we cannot model the entire set of websites that exist, but I think we feel that like 10,000 websites is quite a good, it contains quite a lot of the sort of websites being visited day to day. And we get a differential privacy epsilon of about 7 at the moment from our simulations of the protocol, which is, you know, it's okay. But we also have the sort of added benefit that this is also running on Tor as well. So it's not just a, you know, we've got differential privacy and Tor anonymity working in collaboration. And of course, a key factor is that we've seen HTTPS adoption going up and up over recent years, and the higher that goes, the more effective the protocol is, and the less vulnerable we are to false positives or any issues. And of course, so we think overall that this is a reasonably effective protocol that helps reduce man-in-the-middle attacks on Tor Browser by allowing HSTS to actually be used. And that's me. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, Killian, for the presentation, and that basically sums up all our presentations. We can take some questions now, and so if anybody has any questions, please feel free to raise their hands. Otherwise, thank you to all the speakers for voluntarily accepting the invite and presenting here. And I'll hand it over back to Emiliano.
Great, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Sharad. It was very interesting to hear about your work. Yeah, if there is any questions that people don't want to ask, please feel free to reach out either to me or directly to the speakers. And I think many of us are here at Houston Road today, so we can also chat a little bit person now. If you're around, maybe grab a coffee or something. But yeah, I wanted to thank everyone again for attending, and everyone who presented. Hopefully we can do that. We can do this again with the students, maybe in person next time in the new year, maybe with some good weather. And but yes, well, thanks again, and see you soon.